What up, bitch? Truediltom here. Today we're doing a video on Spengler, as in Oswald Spengler, and the idea of technics, particularly as it relates to Faustian civilization, and what the main motif of Faustian man really is. Faustian is definitely a word that is thrown around a lot in our circles, and today we're going to be looking at it from the Spenglerian view, which of course serves as a great point of influence for the conversation between Heidegger and the postmodernists and other ideas we have been discussing recently. So, Spengler begins with a very interesting comment on the 18th century liberal and Enlightenment thinkers and how they saw man, how they saw him as an entity, and what his nature was. And he writes of how, quote, the 18th century, the age of Robinson Crusoe and Jacques Rousseau, of the English park, and of pastoral poetry, had regarded original man himself as a sort of lamb of the pastures, a peaceful and virtuous creature until culture came to ruin him. And then Spengler goes on to write of how the technical side of man is neglected and seen as unworthy of study by the Enlightenment thinker. But technology could only go unnoticed for so long in this era. After the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of giant manufacturing towns and railway systems, this would open up questions that needed to be answered about what technology's place really is in life. And generally speaking, the literature on technology in the 18th and 19th century was very lacking, chalking up technology to be either indistinguishable from culture, because culture is simply a collection of ideals about utility and subjectuation, aka materialism, or technology was regarded as outside of culture or beneath culture, and nonetheless both reduced technology and any progress in technics to talk of labor saving or utility, with little enthusiasm for the achievements of humanity as a whole. But it should be said that Spengler isn't simply referring to technology, but the overarching theme of technics, of which the latter is included in. And technics doesn't just refer to machines, but it dates back far before mankind and begins with animal life itself. To draw an analogy, technics could be understood as tactics. He writes how, quote, technics is not to be understood in terms of the implement. What matters is not how one fashions things, but what one does with them. Not the weapon, but the battle. Now, man is certainly unique in this regard. I mean, if you look at plant life, they are fixed to a point. They can't get up and move around, obviously. They are pushed around by the wind or other forces in nature. And in other words, they are completely subject to the macrocosm. They are unable to carve out their own place in the world. But in contrast, the animal is able to do just that. The animal can create its own world and effectively detach itself from nature. It creates a world and moves it against the macrocosm. It has freedom where it isn't merely the subject of nature. And Spengler goes on to make a distinction between herbivores and carnivores. He is going to tease out what he believes to be the development of techniques from animal life to its relation with culture in the modern age. So herbivores, as you would have learned in primary school, have their eyes situated on the sides of their head because they survive off plants. They have no need to target prey like a carnivore does, and so subsequently, carnivores have their eyes situated at the front of their heads so that things in front of them can be presented as targets. The carnivore needs a narrow spatial awareness to focus on prey, while the herbivore has a wide spatial awareness to accommodate the unpredictable moves of its predators. That is, death can come from any direction. Now, the techniques of animals are stereotyped. They don't progress outside of or beyond the genus. Animal techniques are embedded, while human techniques escape the genus. Spengler writes of how the bee, ever since it existed, has built its honeycombs exactly as it does now, and will continue to build them so till it is extinct. While with humans, clearly our techniques constantly expand from simple tools to cultures to civilizations. They are conscious, alterable, personal, and inventive. We are the creators of our tactics of living, or our techniques. So, man emerges from the world of the carnivore as a beast of prey. To Spengler, man comes out of spontaneous mutations in nature as a carnivore, but in doing so he adds to the eye of the carnivore that we have just described, and what he adds to it is the hand. And between the two, between the eye and the hand, we see the balance between theory and practice, the eye bringing theory and the hand bringing practice. Now, it should be said that it is a theme of Spengler to talk about the Anglos, the Anglo-Saxons, being involved with this psychologization by which they examine themselves and reflect the contents of them onto the rest of the world in an imperial act. And likewise, Darwinian evolution to Spengler, he thought to be the same, a projection of the British temperament onto nature. He describes the evolutionary process of a slow, phlegmatic alteration as truly appropriate to the English nature, but not of nature as a whole. Instead, Spengler says nature doesn't evolve at all in this sense. There is a tendency to conserve the form rather than evolve it, and then those organisms that are stagnant are wiped out when catastrophes strike. Now, alongside the hand emerges the tool. They come into being together, simply because the unarmed hand is in itself useless. It requires a weapon to become itself a weapon. The tool takes form from the shape of the hand, but also the hand from the shape of the tool. So the two are interdependent, and the significance of the tool is it differentiates man from the genus in the way the animal cannot. The tool is an artifice that exists in opposition to nature, and through tools man differentiates himself from nature and begins the development of culture. Now this part of Spengler is before a lot of the most important works on linguistics that would come in the 20th century was conducted, and so I've done whole live streams and videos that run in contradiction to his account of how culture comes into being. But regardless, this is the Spenglerian view, and Spengler died before he could really culminate his thoughts on prehistoric man, and so his focus was much more on man post-developing a linguistic consciousness. But the greater point is that the hand and the eye represent the division between two types of men, the fact man and the theory man. The eye signifying the latter, as the eye creates a theoretical space, while the hand signifies the fact man, as the hand is for doing. The theory man is concerned with truth, theory, and causality, while the fact man is concerned with ends and means. And this dichotomy can be described as the opposition between the philosopher, the priest, the artist, and the statesman, the merchant, and the military general. There is the thought of the eye and the thought of the hand. For Spengler, the fact man is the man of destiny, while the theory man is interested in causality and evolves the sciences. And from here there is a duality of the causality principle and the destiny idea, and each civilization has a different conception of both. So from this, Spengler describes the human soul as taking its form. There is a uniformity of the impulsive and collective genus. A shared intentionality emerges, and it marches forward in this increasing alienation from nature. Spengler writes about how after every sea voyage, only a proportion of the ships reached port, that in every great building task, no small part of the workmen perished, and that whole tribes starved in times of drought. And clearly, all that mattered was that enough were left to represent the spirit of the whole. And art and culture emerge as a counter-concept to nature, because of which, and as culture develops with ritual, prophesying, painting, archery, warfare, infrastructure, government, and eventually science and mathematics, man moves into his own microcosm that exists against nature, individuating himself more and more from the natural world. The privilege of creation has been wrested from nature, and the creative man steps outside the bounds of nature and departs further and further from her with each creative expansion. But with the rise of shared projects, there needs to be a centralized authority to direct them. At this point, around 3000 BC, the first high cultures come, and then the first cities and high civilizations. Technology transforms to become even more large scale, and these cities are like artificial bubbles where the natural order is unable to make its way in and is disconnected entirely. Instead of natural hierarchies like that of the stupid and smart, weak and strong, those that existed in nature, there becomes nobility, the merchant class, the priest, and the peasant. So this process we are describing is very motivated by the will to power. There is a lot of Nietzschean influence here. He writes, quote, "Man was and is too shallow and cowardly to endure the fact of the mortality of everything living." He wraps it up in rose-colored progress optimism. He heaps upon it the flowers of literature. He crawls behind the shelter of ideals so as not to see anything. But impermanence, the birth and the passing, is the form of all that is actual. He goes on to say ruins of the have-been works of dead cultures lie all about us. The hubris of Prometheus, who thrust his hand into the heavens in order to make the divine power subject to man, carries with it his fall. What then becomes of the chatter about undying achievements?" End quote. So Spengler is describing that it is through culture that we try to escape our mortality. We take that lighting or atmosphere, that linguistic framing, and we try to erect it outside of the process of history to ensure it is made immortal. The metaphysician of each culture isn't reaching inwards and uncovering things about his own context, but is like Prometheus, reaching into the heavens and grasping something transcendental. And finally, Spengler writes, quote, "There are no men in themselves, such as the philosophers talk about, but only men of a time, of a locality, of a race, of a personal caste, who contend in battle with a given world and win through or fail, while the universe around them moves slowly on with a godlike unconcern. This battle is life. Life indeed, in the Nietzschean sense, a grim, pitiless, no-quarter battle of the will to power." End quote. So you can see here how Spengler also influences Heidegger, who in turn opened up a lot of the questions of which postmodernism was responding to. When Spengler says there are no men in themselves, it could have been a point of influence for Heidegger's view of Dasein, by which the most essential mode of being is within the world. We are brought into the world and cannot exist outside it, like a pure, self-subsistent ego. And likewise from here, you can see how one would arrive at Derrida's notion that there is nothing outside the context. But that is just a aside. So nonetheless, in these high civilizations, there are different sciences that are self-contained and enclosed to each group. For the Greeks, there is the science of statics, composed of the dichotomy of form and matter. It is the intellect of Greek sculpture projecting onto the world. With the Arabs, there is the science of alchemy, which is concerned with substances versus attributes. Algebra, that comes from the Arab world, also brings in mysterious quantities like X and Y that correspond with the mysterious substances that are to be transmuted and transformed in alchemy. While in Faustian civilization, we have the science of dynamics, which is concerned with force moving mass. It has a whole dynamic of motion, and calculus measures the motions of bodies through space. It is the language of this science. And in addition, each civilization has its own sense of destiny. The Greeks was premised on Moira, which, like the static sculptural mind, has a spatial boundary of which the gods reside in as well. It is depicted in terms of women and is feminine, while crossing this spatial boundary results in nemesis, by which the god or person is just put back into the spatial boundary. So, as man is disconnected from nature, each act of creation, the emergence of high civilization, and so on, we see from this the rise of the alienated individual. Before, there was only a totality where the tribe didn't afford people individuation, while now there are those that separate themselves from the mass, the independent men who find themselves trapped in a prison of increasing layers of sociality, and so man becomes a slave of his own civilization. This is nature's act of revenge against man's creativity. And Spengler then turns to key differences between Faustian civilization and that of any other. He categorizes Faustian civilization as resulting from the contrast between the Vikings of the blood and the Vikings of the mind. In a sentence, Faustian civilization differs from all other civilizations because the machine is its primary fascination. Monks in the 13th and 14th century began examining technical physical problems at an unprecedented depth, and their curiosity wasn't idle or impractical, or was it concerned with painting a picture of reality, like a sculpture, to reference the Greeks' sense of science and destiny again, but instead, it was dynamic and sought to capture nature's forces that put things in motion and make them inputs into the culture. Spengler writes of the Faustians' technological imperialism, something that could also be potential influence for Heidegger in the question concerning technology. And he specifically refers to Bacon's scientific experiments, which is the interrogation of nature under torture with the rack, lever, and the screw. He writes that they imagined that their desire was to know God, and yet it was the forces of inorganic nature, the invisible energy manifested in all that happens, that they strove to isolate, to seize, and to turn to account. So, the Faustian isn't concerned with stuff, but with forces. Mass is a function of energy, space is theorized as a function of light. The Faustian thought up magnetism, formulated Earth's motion around the sun. There are Newton's laws of motion. Even God himself begins to be thought of as an infinite, omnipresent force. And so, the idea of victory over God and nature, vis-a-vis the ultimate capturing of forces, that of perpetual motion, never let go its hold on us. To create perpetual motion is to create a microcosm that is subject only to its own forces, to man alone, and thus, to have perpetual motion is to become God. This is the ultimate culmination of Prometheus' goal. Spengler writes, the successor of those Gothic monks was the cultured lay inventor, the expert priests of the machine. Finally, with the coming of rationalism, the belief in technics almost becomes a materialistic religion. Technics is eternal and immortal like God the Father. It delivers mankind like God the Son, and it illumines us like God the Holy Ghost. And its worshippers is the progress Philistine of the modern age, which runs from Lametri to Lenin. In reality, the passion of the inventor has nothing whatever to do with its consequences. It is his personal life motive, his personal joy and sorrow. He wants to enjoy his triumph over difficult problems and the wealth and fame that it brings him for their own sake. Whether his discovery is useful or menacing, creative or distributive, he cares not a jot. So, the tragedy of Faustian man is that he suffers from the conflict between spiritual disharmony and the intellect. We had discussed this in the last video on alchemy with Carl Jung, who saw alchemy as the means by which these oppositions could be unified. However, there is a very non-Faustian element to alchemy. Instead, Faustian civilization is the creation of 13th century Gothic monks who are fascinated with the properties of light and magnetism and etc., and would create windmills and lenses in their interests with these things. All these first constructions miniature the universe as a cosmic machine created by God. And so these contraptions of theirs, like the windmill or the lens, would obey the monk just as the universe obeys God. They would create their own microcosm to rule over. And so, for this reason, the Faustian civilization hinges on the desire of the unattainable goal of perpetual motion, a self-perpetuating microcosm that propels itself out of its own inertia forever. And this is motivated out of a will to power, and because of which, the Faustian man is said to be the Viking of the mind. Faustian civilization differs from other civilizations in that others plunder the materials of nature, while Faustians plunder nature for her mode of forces. The forces that create movement in nature are captured and put into the culture. And then Spengler continues to discuss this facet of Faustianism as a tragedy. His inward spiritual necessity for the machine wipes out species, communities, deforests the earth. There is firstly a greater spiritual disconnect between the leaders and the led. They can no longer communicate with each other. If we compare the life of a worker in peasant society to one of the innumerable hands of the machine, unlike a worker in the great constructions of Babylonia and Egypt, the workers of the machine are unable to see the vision of their leader's work. The town worker, unlike the worker of the land, sees his work as merely making its doers happy and enriched, and so they begin to hate them. And in addition, there is a dangerous tension between the machine and the planet. Western technology, contrary to the myth of progress, is finite. It has an end, that is, the overstraining of the planet's resources. This can be thought of in terms of climate change or global warming, but also in mass deforestation and the pollution of lakes and rivers. Just as man revolted from nature with the creation of the microcosm, nature will revolt against man. So in addition, the colonial process that brings the Faustian secrets to other groups through the introduction of technology backfires. The Faustian who developed the machine technique out of pure spiritual necessity gives his way of being to non-whites, of which there is no inward spiritual necessity for technology. To them, technology are just tools to be abused, unsavored, and used against those that had provided them with it. Spengler writes that the history of mankind as a whole is tragic, but the sacrilege and the catastrophe of the Faustian are greater than all others, a special case of man becoming the slave of his own civilization. Now guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and if you want to support the channel, please consider hitting up my Patreon. Even just $1 a video really helps out, and I have a lot of plans for the future that I'm financing, so please consider making a donation. That is plans revolving around the ideas we're discussing, particularly if you would like to see more content. That would be greatly appreciated. I also have a merch site that I plan to revamp soon that you can check out, as most of the current designs may be gone after I announce that. But before I go, Spengler would of course influence Heidegger a lot, and his work on the question concerning technology, and I thought I would end the video by playing an excerpt from The Absolute State, where we did an episode on Heidegger, and I'll link that in the whole episode below in the description. But hopefully this can put into perspective some of the ideas talked about in the past on my channel and build a better web of referentiality for you. So, catch you later, guys. I wanted to say that it needs to be said that we aren't talking about technology as like gadgets, iPhones, video games, and so on, and Heidegger's criticism isn't concerned with that, but he's more concerned with essence. Just like the word scientism, as opposed to science, we can kind of call what we're talking about technicity instead of technology. And just like anything else, Heidegger wants to see how technology conceals things and how it comes into being. He wants to look at technology's causes. Now, there are two like main aspects of being revealed here, relevant here, I should say. And you brought them up earlier, that I think that would be kind of interesting to elaborate on, that of poiesis from the ancient Greeks, which was like a way of revealing in which things come into being through the cultivation of a craftsman, when someone carefully and meticulously creates something and brings it into being, this being applicable to both art and technology. But then there is also what we talked about before, which I wanted to, where I just mentioned it in passing, which is physis, the original understanding of being before Plato. And this is when something brings itself into being without a craftsman or a creator. Like a flower blooming, it comes into being on its own and in a spontaneous way. It's being and it's becoming. These two forms of being also present themselves actually in like the two different types of creation myths that we see a lot, like that of poiesis, where the world is created like we are accustomed to in the Christian mythos. But then there is also when the world comes into being spontaneously, like in the myth of Gaia, where it was believed that the goddess was the ancestral mother of all life and literally gave birth to the world. So both of these aspects of being represent the bringing forth of concealment from unconcealment. And technology, like science, has this imperial quality where it puts forward to nature its own way of revealing, where technology challenges nature, just like science does. But instead of instead of fitting nature into this groundwork where nothing is spared, which I just described with science before you went away, Dick. It demands from nature and predates nature for its energy, of which technology then stores and reserves for use at another time. Just like science, there is this imperial gaze to technology that looks upon the world and sees only a total of potential things that can be extracted, like uranium, oil, nitrogen, and etc. It is this constant process of breaking up nature and putting the nature on demand in the form of standing reserve. In this way, technology like rapes nature, not from the sense of like when you hear lefties say that in that with, you know, global warming or some shit, but it rapes it from the stance of being. And here we have to then go back to the fact, because we are talking about being, when we say technology, we're not referring to gadgets and objects. It is possible, as you brought up, for technology to not be this way, like if we consider the technique of the ancient world and the ancient Greeks, something as simple as like building a bridge over a river. It is clear that a bridge doesn't like extract or prey upon nature, but this would be contrasted if you take that same river and you resort to the modern world where we have like a hydroelectric dam built there, and that extracts energy from it and puts it for standing reserve, being a disruptive force on nature. And instead Heidegger is referring to the large-scale modern technology that dominates and actually enslaves our world. It is here where all things become a matter of standing reserve, including humans, by the way. We are human resources under this idea of technicity. But it's also worth bringing up, I think, that in contrast to science and technology that is predicated on making itself the only mode of revealing with its imperial gaze, there's also the artist, who is a big figure in Heidegger's work. The artist also picks up aspects of things that have been concealed and then brings them into visibility. He has his own mode of revealing. But the artist, unlike science and technology, creates worlds through the creation of artworks. As we talked about before, metaphysics grounds an age. And so being it's going to be different for the inhabitants of each point in time, and the artist takes those aspects of being that have withdrawn themselves in his age, and he creates his own world that runs against that of his age. There is this tension in a basic work of art between a world of the artist and the earth, and in contrast to the artist, science and technology, instead of creating worlds, de-worlds the world. It's like Plato lifting the world up into this abstract, artificial, and theoretical zone. The artist creates a world where science, while on the other hand, science breaks up the world and stores it as energy, and the scientific understanding of being is reduced to just quantity, to extraction and storage. And the modern understanding of being, Heidegger refers to it, that we just described now, is Gastel, which translates to enframing.